dining room went quiet, the way a room only goes quiet when someone has said something on purpose. Christmas dinner, 6:18 p.m. Candles already burned down to stubs because Patricia likes to light them before anyone arrives, so they look already lived in. 12 people at the table, the good tablecloth out, the same one every year, a small burn mark near the corner from a candle incident nobody ever talks about. My husband, 2 seats down, mid-sentence, stopped. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer was still counting down on something nobody would remember to take out of the oven for another 10 minutes. Patricia set down the gravy boat, turned to her sister across the table, and said it like she was reading a place card, like it cost her nothing at all. Elena's lovely, of course, but she'll never really be family. Not the way blood is family. Nobody corrected her. Not even Josh. Not in that first second. And I remember thinking, with a strange, cold clarity that had nothing to do with hurt, she has no idea what she just said this in front of. I remember the exact weight of my fork in my hand. I remember the sound of the furnace kicking on in the hallway behind me, the only sound in that room for a full 2 seconds after she said it. But here's what Patricia Bennett didn't know. Sitting at the head of a table in a house with her name on the mailbox. The deed behind that mailbox had my name on it too. It had for 5 years. She just never asked to see it. Welcome back to Home of Secrets. I'm Elena Marsh, 31, an acquisitions analyst for a real estate fund in Denver, Colorado. This is the story of the Christmas my mother-in-law told an entire table I'd never be real family, in a house I quietly owned the paper on, and she didn't know it. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you've secretly been holding up, comment below. And subscribe, because you need to see the New Year's meeting she called next. I married into the Bennetts 8 years ago, and from the first dinner, I understood the shape of that family the way I understand a bad loan file. Quickly, and without needing anyone to explain the numbers out loud. Chelsea, Josh's younger sister, got the family china the year she turned 25, to start her own home someday, even though she was living in her parents' basement at the time with no home to start. I got a set of dish towels the year I turned 25, wrapped, at Patricia's insistence. So you'd have something practical for your little apartment. A sentence she delivered with a smile that never once reached her eyes. I still have the towels. I've never used them. I don't think I could tell you why I kept them, except that some part of me knew, even then, that I'd want the receipt on this someday. There's a tradition in that family. 1 glass ornament, hand-painted, a new one added to the tree every Christmas for each real family member, going back to Patricia's own mother. Josh has 31 of them, 1 for every year since his birth. Chelsea has 26. In 8 Christmases as Josh's wife, I have 0, not because anyone forgot. Patricia mentioned it once at year 3, almost kindly, refilling my wine glass at the same time so the sting would land soft. Oh, we don't add spouses until, well, we'll see how things go, won't we? I remember smiling and saying something gracious back. I don't remember what. I remember the wine glass more clearly than my own words. I noticed. I wrote nothing down yet, not then. That discipline came later, out of necessity, not habit. But I noticed the way you notice a foundation crack before you ever call it structural. Chelsea's failed nursing program in 2019 got framed, at Thanksgiving, as finding her path, with Patricia adding unprompted, that not everyone's meant to rush into a career the way some people do. My promotion to senior analyst that same year, 6 years of overtime, a licensing exam I'd studied for at a kitchen table most nights for 4 months, got a nod, a that's nice, dear, and a change of subject to whether Chelsea might try culinary school next. Josh noticed some of it too, quietly, the way people notice things about their own family they've decided not to have the fight about. He'd squeeze my hand under the table sometimes, which I understood as its own kind of apology, offered instead of the one that would have actually needed saying out loud, at that table to his mother. That's the imbalance. It wasn't cruelty at first. It was arithmetic done quietly, the same way I'd learned to do arithmetic quietly myself, just in a different column. I remember the exact dinner, my second Christmas as Josh's fiancé, when Patricia first explained the ornament rule to a cousin visiting from out of state, gesturing at the tree like a docent at a small museum. Blood only, until we know for certain someone's staying. I was standing 4 feet away, holding a plate of appetizers I'd made myself that year, trying to prove exactly the thing she'd just said couldn't be proven with anything short of a birth certificate. In March of 2020, Gary Bennett's manufacturing plant shut its doors for good, 4 months before he would have hit the pension threshold he'd worked toward for 11 years. He was 57. The mortgage on the house, the same house that tradition, china, and 31 ornaments all lived inside, was 6 weeks from a notice of default by June. I found out the way I find out most things in that family. Sideways. Through Josh, who'd heard it from Chelsea, who wasn't supposed to say anything. I ran the numbers before I told Josh I could help. The house was underwater by less than the note's face value, which meant a private party could acquire the distressed note directly from the bank at a discount, ahead of the foreclosure auction. If that party moved fast and had the right relationships. I had both. It's my job. I didn't tell Patricia or Gary who the buyer was. I set up a holding entity, Marsh Bridge Holdings LLC, and had the funds council structure the acquisition as an arm's-length purchase, the note reassigned. A new private forbearance agreement drawn up in the LLC's name at a rate gentler than the bank's, quietly, through a loan servicing company that never mentioned Elena Marsh anywhere on a single piece of paper Patricia ever read. Josh knew. Josh was the only one who knew. We agreed together that his parents would take the help easier from a boutique relief servicer than from their son's wife. And given how the next 5 years went, I think we were right. And I also think, some nights, that agreeing to that silence cost me more than either of us admitted at the time. For 5 years, on the first of every month, 2,130 throws moved from an account with my name nowhere near it into a servicing account that quietly kept my in-laws' house out of foreclosure. By that December, the running total was $164,000. Money I hadn't spent on a house of my own. A wedding upgrade, the maternity leave cushion Josh and I kept meaning to build and never quite did. Because there was always the first of the month, and the number never got smaller. It just became the baseline, the way a heartbeat becomes background noise. I want to be precise about what those 5 years actually cost, because quiet years makes it sound peaceful, and it wasn't. I sat in my car in the funds parking garage more than once, after closing out the monthly transfer on my phone, just breathing, doing the math on what that money could have been instead, and then going back inside to run acquisition models for strangers' distressed properties like I hadn't just quietly rescued my own in-laws again. Josh and I postponed a kitchen renovation twice. We drove the same car 4 years past when we could have upgraded. Small things. They added up into a shape I only fully recognized much later, looking back at all of it at once. During those same 5 years, Chelsea moved back into the basement twice more, both times funded quietly by a little help from your father's severance that had run out in 2021, money that, I now understood with total clarity, doing this math at my own kitchen table, could only have been the mortgage relief I was providing, redirected. Patricia bought a new car for Chelsea's 28th birthday. Cash, no loan. The same spring I was quietly extending an extra grace period, on the note because Gary had needed knee surgery and I didn't want the household budget stretched any further than it already was. I sat, through 5 Christmases, where Patricia introduced me to Guess as Josh's wife. She does something with numbers, and introduced Chelsea, unemployed the entire time as our Chelsea, still finding her calling. We're just so patient with her. I sat through a 4th of July barbecue in 2023, where Patricia told her book club, within my hearing, that Elena keeps to herself, hard to really let her in. While I was 3 years into being the only reason there was a house for the barbecue to happen in. I sat through Gary's 60th birthday dinner that same year, where Patricia toasted the family that always shows up for each other, looking at Chelsea when she said it. Not at me, not once. In a room I was quite literally keeping the lights on in. I didn't correct her. I went home and started for the first time a note on my phone. Just a line, time-stamped. I told myself it was nothing. It became, over the next 2 years, the most important file I have ever kept. Christmas dinner, 6:18 p.m. The conversation had drifted, as it always did by dessert, to the ornament tree, which stood in the front window the way it had every year I'd been coming to that house. Chelsea's 26 glass bulbs, Josh's 31, catalogued out loud by Patricia's sister, who asked, not unkindly, "Elena, don't you have one yet?" It was a genuine question, I think, asked by someone who'd simply never noticed the absence before that moment. The way you don't notice a missing stair until you're the one who nearly falls on it. Patricia answered before I could. That was the part that mattered. She wasn't goaded into it. She volunteered it, easily. The way you volunteer a fact you've simply always believed and never once considered saying differently in front of company. Elena's lovely, of course, but she'll never really be family. Not the way blood is family. A small laugh after it, aimed at her sister, like she'd said something charming, reaching for the gravy boat again, as if the sentence weighed nothing at all, leaving her mouth. Josh's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Gary studied his plate, the way he studied most things that happened at that table involving his wife. Chelsea, across from me, didn't even look up. She'd heard versions of this sentence about me for 8 years and had stopped registering it as news a long time before I had. I didn't raise my voice. I set my own fork down, tines aligned with the edge of the plate, a habit I didn't know yet I'd picked up until I noticed my own hand doing it. Deliberate and slow. The way you close a laptop on something you're not ready to argue with yet. That's an interesting thing to say, I said. In a house I've been keeping out of foreclosure since 2020, the table did the thing tables do when a sentence lands and nobody yet has the tools to process it. A half second. Where 12 people all recalculate at once and none of them say so out loud. Patricia laughed again, thinner this time, reaching for her wine. I don't know what that means, Elena. You will, I said. I didn't explain further. I finished my water, thanked her for dinner in the same even tone I'd used to end any meeting, and left without slamming a single door, Josh 2 steps behind me in the driveway, quiet the entire ride home in a way I understood completely, because he was doing his own version of the math I'd already finished 5 years earlier. Nobody at that table stopped me. Nobody said her name in the tone it deserved. That silence, I'd learn later, was its own kind of information. I didn't call Patricia. What I did the next morning over coffee I barely remember drinking was open the servicing portal for Marshbridge Holdings LLC and review, line by line, every payment made and received on the Bennett note since 2020. Not to change anything yet, just to confirm the ledger was airtight before I did anything with the anger that was, admittedly, sitting somewhere underneath all that arithmetic. Then I pulled the recorded assignment of the deed of trust from the county registrar's site, the document that had sat quietly on public record for 5 years without anyone in that family ever thinking to look. It named Marshbridge Holdings LLC as the current beneficiary of record, which meant, in every legal sense that mattered, it named me. I didn't accelerate the note. I didn't threaten foreclosure. That was never the point, and I want to be clear about that, because I've seen what that kind of leverage does to people when it's wielded out of anger instead of clarity, and I'd spent 5 years being careful precisely, so I'd never become the kind of person who used this the way it could have been used. What I did was stop absorbing the forbearance discount I'd quietly extended for 5 years, effective February 1st, reverting the note to its original contractual rate. Still fair, still legal. Simply no longer a favor extended to a woman who'd just told a room full of relatives I wasn't real family. No rage in any of it. Just arithmetic. A rate reversion that added $312 a month to a household that, as of that January, I now suspected had considerably less slack in it than anyone assumed. By mid-January, the story reaching the extended family was that Elena had made a scene at Christmas over some comment about ornaments, which was, I'll admit, a genuinely impressive act of narrative engineering, reducing a 5-year quiet rescue and a public insult down to a woman who couldn't take a joke about tree decorations. Patricia's sister texted Josh to ask if I was doing all right. Seemed very tense lately. Cousin I'd met exactly once posted a vague sentiment on social media about protecting family peace during the holidays, which 14 relatives understood immediately to be about me. Patricia herself brought a plate of cookies to Josh's cousin's baby shower in February and, according to Josh, spent 10 minutes describing how hard she'd tried with me over the years. But some people just keep themselves at a distance. I heard about most of this secondhand, through Josh, who'd started, without my asking, quietly correcting the record himself in small ways. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, which I understood as its own kind of courage from a man who'd spent 30 years learning not to contradict his mother at a family gathering. I told him not to fight that battle for me yet. Not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I already knew, by February, exactly what document was about to make every one of those conversations irrelevant. I didn't respond to any of it publicly myself. I opened a folder on my own laptop, separate from the fund's servers, labeled simply Record, and put everything into it. The LLC formation documents, 5 years of servicing statements, the recorded assignment, a time-stamped note of exactly what Patricia said at the table, written the night it happened while every word was still exact. I added the cousin's post as a screenshot, no commentary, and a brief note about the baby shower comment, second-hand but dated. I wasn't building a weapon yet. I was building a floor to stand on, in case I ever needed one steadier than my own memory, or Josh's. The discovery didn't come from anger. It came from paperwork, the way it always does in my line of work. In late January, the servicing company flagged an inquiry on the Bennett property. Someone requesting a payoff quote and a lien search, preparing, it looked like, for a refinance or a sale. I pulled the county title report myself that afternoon, the way I'd pull any file crossing my desk, and found a second lien on the house I had never authorized and had no record of. A home equity line, opened 18 months earlier for $38,000, secured against a house whose primary note I held. Gary Bennett's signature was on the application. Gary Bennett, when I gently, carefully asked Josh to ask his father about it that weekend, had no memory of signing anything and no idea a second lien existed against his own home. I remember Josh calling me from his parents' driveway afterward, his voice doing something I'd never heard it do before, somewhere between disbelief and a kind of grief for a version of his mother he'd apparently never actually had either. Patricia had opened it. Using a joint signing authority from an old power of attorney, Gary had given her years earlier for convenience during a hospital stay. She'd forged his fresh signature onto the new application, rather than using the old authority directly, because the lender required a current signature and Gary, by then, was asking too many questions about money for her to risk involving him. The $38,000 had gone, per the closing statement, largely toward a country club initiation fee and a landscaping overhaul completed the same spring Patricia hosted her sister's 50th anniversary party. The same spring, I realized going back through my own records that I'd quietly extended the note's grace period, because I thought the household was stretched thin from Gary's knee surgery, and the payoff quote she'd requested wasn't for a refinance. It was preparation for a new deed, a transfer she was quietly arranging with her own estate attorney, to remove Gary's name as sole survivor beneficiary and retitle the house, upon his death, entirely to Chelsea. Josh and I were to be excluded outright, formalized in writing, the same winter she'd told a room full of family that I'd never really belong in it. I sat with the estate attorney's letter for a long time before I showed it to Josh, trying to decide if there was any version of this that wasn't exactly what it looked like. There wasn't. My ally through all of this was my boss, Diane Okafor, who I finally told the whole situation to that week. 5 years of silence about my own in-laws unraveling in about 20 minutes in her office, between 2 acquisition calls she'd rescheduled without me having to ask. She'd seen forged signature liens before, more than a few, in distressed portfolios she'd worked over 20 years in this business. She looked at the second lien, the payoff request, and the estate attorney's letter for a long moment before she said quietly, "Elena, you don't have a family disagreement. You have a fraud on a lien you hold the senior position on, and a woman about to disinherit her own husband's rightful heirs without his knowledge. Only one of those needs your feelings in the room. Let's build the other one first." That was the moment this stopped being about a cruel sentence at a dinner table. It became about a man named Gary, who deserved to know what had been done to his own signature, and a house that was about to be quietly stolen out from under the one person in that family who actually had a legal claim to protect it. I didn't go to Patricia. I went to Gary alone on a Tuesday afternoon while Patricia was at the club, and I laid the second lien and his forged signature on his kitchen table, the way I'd lay evidence on any file. No accusation in my voice, just documents, dated and indexed, the same way I'd have presented them to anyone else's father in anyone else's distressed file. Gary went very still reading it. He put his glasses on, then took them off, then put them back on, the way people do when they're hoping the second read will say something different than the first. Then he asked me, in a voice I'd never heard him use in 8 years, whose name was actually on the deed of trust for his own house. I told him the truth I'd been keeping for 5 years, mine through an LLC since 2020, because the bank had been 6 weeks from taking it, and I hadn't wanted him to have to know that in the moment it happened. He didn't get angry at me. He sat with that for almost a full minute, staring at his own hands on the table, and then he said, "You saved this house and you let my wife tell you that you weren't family in it." I didn't have an answer for that yet. I still don't fully. I told him I hadn't done it to be owed anything. He said quietly that he understood that, and that it made the whole thing worse somehow, not better. Gary revoked the old power of attorney that same week, in writing through his own attorney, not mine, deliberately, so nothing about this would look like my fund forcing his hand. He reported the forged signature to the lender's fraud department himself, sitting across from a claims investigator for 90 minutes, describing a marriage he was only just beginning to fully see the shape of. He contacted the estate attorney Patricia had retained and instructed her, formally, to halt any retitling pending a full review, a call that attorney later told Gary she'd been uneasy about from the start but had no standing to refuse, given how the paperwork had been presented to her. Patricia, once she realized Gary knew, tried twice to reach me directly. One voicemail insisting this was a private family matter that didn't need lawyers, delivered in a tone that assumed I'd simply fall back in line the way I always had. And one message to Josh asking him to talk some sense into his wife, as though $38,000 and a forged signature were a disagreement about seating arrangements. I didn't respond to either. I spent that week instead preparing a full accounting of the note, the assignment, and the 5 years of payments, in case anyone in that family needed finally to see the real ledger instead of the story Patricia had been telling about it for as long as I'd known her. Diane, when I told her how the week had gone, said one thing that stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this whole story. "You didn't do anything to her, Elena. You just stopped doing something for her that she never knew she was receiving. Those aren't the same thing, no matter what she tells people." I wrote that down too, in the same file as everything else, because I suspected I'd need to remind myself of it more than once before this was over. Patricia called the family meeting herself, for New Year's Day the following winter, at the house, with a notary present, the same estate attorney's paralegal, sent ahead to formalize what Patricia still believed was a simple retitling in Chelsea's favor, before Gary's revoked power of attorney had fully filtered through the system in her mind. 9 people were in that living room by 11 a.m. Patricia's sister, 2 cousins, Chelsea, Gary, Josh, and the notary, folder open on the coffee table between 2 mugs of coffee nobody was drinking. There was a plate of the same shortbread Patricia always made, untouched, and the tree still up in the front window from the season before. 31 ornaments for Josh, 26 for Chelsea, none for me, the way it had been every year I'd stood in that room. I hadn't been invited. I came anyway, at Gary's direct request, standing quietly by the doorway the way you'd stand at the back of a hearing you already know the outcome of. Patricia saw me and her whole posture changed, the practiced warmth draining out of it in real time. "This doesn't concern you, Elena. It concerns the fraud department at your lender," I said evenly, "and it concerns whoever's name is actually on the deed of trust for this house, which isn't yours to retitle." "It's mine." The notary looked up sharply from her folder. Patricia's sister set down her coffee. Patricia said, "That's not possible," in the voice of someone who has just heard a number that doesn't fit any equation she's ever run, glancing toward Gary as if he might correct me. Gary answered before I had to, standing up from his chair for the first time since I'd walked in. "It's true, Patricia. Has been for 5 years. She kept this house out of foreclosure while you were taking out loans on it behind my back and forging my name to do it." Patricia's face did something I'd genuinely never seen it do in 8 years. It emptied out completely. The performance gone all at once, because there was no longer an audience left who believed it. She looked at Chelsea, I think for support, the way she always had. Chelsea, for the first time in this entire story, looked directly at her mother instead of her plate, and said nothing back. I said one more thing, quietly, not for Patricia, but for the room. I was never going to be real family the way blood is family. You said that yourself, at your own table, in front of everyone. I just didn't realize until this year that it was never really about blood. It was about who was allowed to know they were holding this family up. Nobody defended her. That silence this time belonged to me. For a long moment after that, nobody in the room moved. The notary quietly began gathering her papers back into the folder without being asked. Patricia's sister reached for her coat, murmuring something about needing to check on the car, an excuse everyone in that room recognized as the sound of a person trying to leave a collapsing building without being seen running. Chelsea stayed seated, still looking at her mother, waiting, I think, for a version of an explanation that never actually arrived. The retitling collapsed on the spot. The notary closed her folder without a signature and left within 10 minutes, later confirming to Gary's attorney that she'd had no idea the underlying deed was contested, and that she'd have refused the appointment outright if she had. Within 3 months, the ledger settled the way these things do, once the real documents are finally the ones doing the talking. Gary's fraud complaint led the lender to void the second lien entirely, reclassifying the $38,000 as an unauthorized transaction rather than a debt against the house, sparing Gary any liability for a signature he never gave. Patricia was not criminally charged. The lender chose a civil resolution rather than a referral. Given Gary's age and standing in the community, though she was permanently barred from any future signing authority on his accounts, a restriction now noted on file with both the bank and Gary's estate attorney. She resigned from the country club board that spring, quietly, after her membership became a subject the family no longer discussed at dinner, and stopped attending the book club that had first heard her say, "I kept to myself." Gary and Patricia separated in April. As of this recording, they haven't reconciled, and Gary has said more than once that he isn't sure they will. Chelsea, for the first time in 8 years, called me directly in May, not to apologize for her mother, but to ask plainly if I'd be willing to help her understand what an actual budget looked like, since apparently no one in that house ever had one that wasn't secretly mine. I said yes. We've met twice since, at a coffee shop near my office, going over her expenses line by line the way I'd go over anyone's file. No judgment in it, just numbers. Finally, being allowed to be numbers instead of weapons. I still hold the note. Gary asked me to keep the servicing arrangement exactly as it was, at the original fair rate. No reversion needed anymore. An arrangement now openly discussed at every family gathering instead of quietly buried under one, which is, I think, the part of this whole story that still catches in my throat the most, more than the apology ever did. It's December again now. The tree in that living room has 31 ornaments for Josh, 26 for Chelsea, and for the first time in 9 Christmases, one for me, hand-painted by Gary himself this year, not Patricia. A small glass house with a tiny gold key painted on the door, done in a shade of gold that didn't quite match any of the others, because he'd bought the paint himself at a craft store in Guest. He told me, handing it to me at the same table where all of this started, "You held this house up before any of us knew it needed holding. That's what real family does. I should have said that a long time before you had to prove it." I didn't say anything back right away. I just held the ornament for a while, turning it over. That small, imperfect gold key catching the light from the same window. Patricia's tree had stood in for 8 Christmases without me in it. Josh added his own to the tree that night, too. A smaller version of the same house, which he'd apparently commissioned quietly the week before without telling me, because he'd wanted, he said, for there to be 2 now, his and mine, the same shape, side by side, so it would never look like an afterthought again. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up before anyone asks them to, and who stay standing quietly in the doorway even after they're told they don't belong in the room. If you've ever quietly held up more than anyone gave you credit for, you already know the particular relief of finally being seen for it. Share this with someone who's ever been told they weren't real family. Comment below if you've ever kept a ledger nobody knew existed. And subscribe. There's another one of these waiting for you next week.